The Council of Unified Territories had never been challenged. Not once in 3,000 cycles. Not by the militant Krathgor, not by the hive-minded Vesic, not even by the stubborn Torlian Federation who held out for 70 rotations before surrendering. So, when the newest species, these soft-skinned bipeds who called themselves humans, received the compliance directive, we expected the usual progression: shock, deliberation, acceptance, integration. What we got instead was laughter. I still remember the transmission. My sensory stalks had been perfectly aligned, my secondary brain processing the linguistic patterns of Earth's dominant communication systems when the response came through. Not from their governmental bodies, not from their military commanders, but from a single human female standing in what appeared to be a modest dwelling, wearing casual attire and holding a beverage that steamed in the ambient temperature of her habitat. Her name was Victoria Kane, and she was smiling. "Let me get this straight," she said, taking a slow sip from her container. "You want us to hand over our weapons, submit to your authority, integrate into your little galactic country club, and basically do whatever you tell us from now on?" Ambassador Quix 12 straightened his thoracic segments. He had delivered this message to 47 species. His tone remained patient, measured. "The terms are non-negotiable. Your species has developed faster-than-light capability. Under galactic law, you must now comply with the established order. Failure to do so will result in economic sanctions, followed by military intervention if necessary." Victoria Kane set down her beverage. The smile remained, but something shifted in her facial features. Her eyes, those peculiar forward-facing organs that suggested a predatory evolutionary background, seemed to brighten with what I would later recognize as anticipation. "Here's the thing," she said, leaning back against the surface, behind her. "We don't really do the whole follow orders from distant bureaucrats thing anymore. We tried that for a few thousand years. Didn't work out great. Had to have some pretty messy revolutions to sort it all out. So thanks for the offer, but we're going to have to decline." Quix 12's translator unit must have malfunctioned. That was the only explanation. "You misunderstand. This is not an offer. This is a legal requirement under the treaties that govern all spacefaring civilizations. Treaties we didn't sign. That is irrelevant. The treaties predate your species' existence. Then they definitely don't apply to us." Victoria Kane picked up a small data pad, glancing at it briefly. "Besides, I've been reading through your compliance directive. Fascinating stuff. Clause 73 particularly caught my attention. The one about resource allocation being determined by the Council based on species contribution metrics. Sounds an awful lot like taxation without representation, which, fun historical fact, we also had a revolution about. The communication chamber had gone silent. 17 species representatives watched the exchange through their viewing ports. This was not following protocol. This was not how first contact proceeded. "Your resistance is illogical," Quix 12 stated, his voice modulator clicking with what might have been irritation. "The Council commands forces that dwarf your primitive military capabilities. Your largest vessels would be classified as cargo transports in our fleet. Your weapons technology is centuries behind our defensive capabilities alone." Victoria Kane nodded slowly, that smile never wavering. "You know what? You're absolutely right. Your tech is way better than ours. Your ships are bigger. Your weapons are scarier. You've probably got all sorts of fancy tricks we haven't even dreamed up yet." Finally, reason. I felt my respiratory system relax. Perhaps this species would be sensible after all. However, Victoria Kane continued, and my respiratory system immediately tensed again. "That's kind of assuming we'd fight fair. And honestly, that seems like a really stupid assumption to make about humans." Quix 12's mandibles twitched. "Are you threatening the Council?" "Threatening? No, no, no." She waved her hand in a dismissive gesture. "I'm just saying, If you come to Earth expecting a traditional military engagement with clearly defined battle lines and honorable combat, you're going to be really disappointed. We've had thousands of years to perfect the art of asymmetric warfare. Guerrilla tactics, terrorism, sabotage, making life absolutely miserable for occupying forces. We're creative like that. This is your official response? Quix12 asked, his entire body rigid with what I recognized as barely contained fury. You refuse the directive? Oh, this isn't our official response. Victoria Kane's smile widened. This is just me, one random person on one random planet, telling you how this is going to go. See, by the time your transmission reached us and you got our response back, we figured you'd send a fleet. Standard intimidation tactic, right? Show up with overwhelming force, park a bunch of scary warships in orbit, and wait for the primitives to wet themselves. She paused, checking her datapad again. So, we did some math. Accounting for your transmission time, the likely speed of your vessels based on the tech signatures we detected, and the distance from your nearest outpost. Your fleet should be arriving right about now. Every display panel in the council chamber activated simultaneously. Fleet Commander Zalvor's image appeared, his facial tendrils writhing in confusion. Council, we have achieved orbit around the human homeworld, but there's a situation. Report. Quix12's voice was ice. Thousands of small craft. Too small to be military vessels, too numerous to be coincidental. They're not attacking, just surrounding us. And we're receiving a transmission. On every screen, Victoria Kane's image multiplied. She was somehow broadcasting directly into council systems. So here's the deal, she said, her tone conversational. Those little ships around your fleet? They're loaded with nuclear warheads. Old tech, I know, super primitive. But here's the fun part about fission weapons. They're really, really dirty. And there are about 6,000 of them positioned at strategic points around your formation. Now, could your shields probably handle the blasts? Sure, but radiation is tricky. It gets into your ship systems, contaminates your life support, makes everything just gross to deal with. Zalvor's image showed his command crew scrambling. They're bluffing. Primitive nuclear devices couldn't penetrate our shielding. You're right, Victoria Kane agreed, as if she could hear him. They probably can't. But here's the thing. Do you want to test that theory? Because unlike you, we're perfectly fine with mutually assured destruction. We almost did it to ourselves like 6 times during the 20th century. It's kind of our thing. I watched my superior's chromatic sacs shift through the entire spectrum of agitation. This was unprecedented. This was madness. You would destroy yourselves to resist integration? Quix12 demanded. Destroy ourselves? No. Victoria Kane held up a different datapad. See, those are just the greeting party. While we were chatting, we've also launched approximately 200,000 kinetic kill vehicles on randomized trajectories throughout the system. Not aimed at your fleet specifically. Just sort of. Everywhere. Moving really fast. Basically, space shrapnel, traveling at significant fractions of light speed. We can recall them, or we can let them keep going. Your choice. This is insane. Maybe? She shrugged. Or maybe it's just really aggressive negotiation. Here's what's going to happen. Your fleet is going to leave. You're going to go back to your council and explain that Earth is happy to engage in diplomatic relations, trade agreements, cultural exchange, all that good stuff. But we do it as equals, or we don't do it at all, because we're not joining your little empire. We could obliterate your planet from orbit, Zalvor threatened, though his voice lacked conviction. Victoria Kane's expression didn't change. You could try, but we've got these things called dead man switches. The second, our defense grid detects sustained orbital bombardment. Every single weapons platform we've ever built activates automatically. Nuclear, biological, chemical, kinetic, experimental stuff, We haven't even tested yet. All of it launches. Some of it at your fleet. Sure. But most of it? Just out into space. On trajectories we've carefully calculated to reach every major trade route, every inhabited system within 50 light-years, every single council facility we've identified. We might go down, but we're taking a whole lot of real estate with us. The silence in the council chamber was absolute. You're bluffing, Quix 12 said, but even his translator couldn't hide the uncertainty. We once had a war that killed something like 70 million people. You know what we did after? We invented weapons that could kill that many people in an afternoon. Then we pointed those weapons at each other for 50 years, knowing that using them would end civilization as we knew it. And we just lived like that. Because we'd rather have the option to destroy everything than submit to someone else's authority. She leaned forward, and for the first time, the smile faded. So no, Ambassador Quix 12 of the Council of Unified Territories, we're not bluffing. We're also not trying to start a war. We're just making it really clear that conquering Earth would cost way more than you'd ever gain. We're a stubborn, spiteful, self-destructive species that has survived ice ages, supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, and our own worst impulses. We didn't crawl our way to the top of our food chain just to bow down to someone else's. The displays flickered. Another transmission, this time from Earth's surface, multiple locations, thousands of humans, all broadcasting similar messages. A pattern was emerging. This wasn't one rogue individual. This was coordinated. This was consensus. Pull the fleet back, I found myself saying, my translator unit vocalizing before my primary brain could stop me. Quix 12's sensory stalks swiveled toward me. Vex 9, you presume to give orders? I presume to recognize a losing scenario when I see one. I gestured to the displays. They've weaponized chaos. They've made their own extinction into a threat. This is not a species we can integrate through force. They're primitives. They're insane, I corrected, which makes them unpredictable, which makes them dangerous. We have protocols for dealing with hostile species. We have protocols for dealing with aggressive species. We don't have protocols for dealing with species who are willing to burn down the galaxy just to avoid being told what to do. Victoria Kane's image was still displayed across every screen. She had picked up her beverage again, taking another calm sip, as if she hadn't just threatened to destabilize an entire sector of space. I'm going to go make dinner now, she announced. You folks have about 6 hours to get your fleet out of our system before people start getting really nervous and someone does something stupid. We're looking forward to proper diplomatic relations. On equal terms? Have a great day. The transmission ended. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Fleet Commander Zalvor's voice crackled through the communication system. Council. Requesting permission to withdraw. The humans have continued to launch projectiles. My tactical officer estimates they've deployed enough kinetic weapons to threaten navigation throughout the inner system for the next decade, if they're not recalled. Withdraw, Quix 12 said quietly. Ambassador, withdraw the fleet, now. I watched the tactical displays as our vessels began their departure sequence. The human projectiles maintained their trajectories for another 3 minutes, long enough to make the point clear, then began receiving recall signals. Slowly, methodically, they adjusted course back toward Earth's gravity well. They planned this, Senior Counselor Hex Prime observed, his optical sensors reviewing the recorded data. The timing, the deployment, the coordination. They predicted our response cycle perfectly. Impossible, Quix 12 muttered. They're a newly spacefaring species. A newly spacefaring species that has apparently been preparing for extraterrestrial contact for quite some time. Hex Prime manipulated his control interface, pulling up historical transmissions from Earth. They've been broadcasting their location and nature into space for over a century. They've created thousands of fictional scenarios about first contact. They've war-gamed every possible variation of this exact situation. So what do we do? Another counselor asked. Hex Prime's chromatic sacs displayed a pattern I had never seen before. If I had to translate it into human terms, it might have been amusement. We do exactly what Victoria Kane suggested. We open diplomatic relations. On equal terms. Unacceptable! They violated every protocol. They violated protocols they never agreed to follow. Hex Prime turned his attention to the data streaming in from the human homeworld. And in doing so, they've demonstrated several concerning capabilities. They can predict our strategic movements. They can coordinate global responses in timeframes that should be impossible for their level of development. They're willing to embrace tactics we would consider beyond the pale. And most importantly, they're absolutely serious about their threats. You're suggesting we capitulate to terrorists? I'm suggesting we recognize reality. Hex Prime closed the data streams. The humans aren't going to submit. They've made that clear. We can either work with them as partners or treat them as enemies. And I, for one, do not want to spend the next century dealing with human guerrilla warfare across council space. Quix-12's entire body sagged. 3,000 cycles of successful integration, ended by one species of stubborn bipeds with a tendency towards self-destructive defiance. Open diplomatic channels, he said, finally. Standard protocols for autonomous entities. And someone get me everything we have on human history. If we're going to negotiate with them, I need to understand what we're dealing with. I volunteered for that assignment. Something about Victoria Kane's smile had intrigued me. How could a species be so comfortable with the prospect of mutual destruction? What evolutionary path had created beings who would rather die than submit? The data that came back over the following cycles was illuminating and terrifying, and, I had to admit, somewhat impressive. Humans had fought wars lasting decades over concepts like freedom and self-determination. They had overthrown governments, toppled empires, and reshaped their entire social order multiple times. They had developed weapons of such horrific efficiency that they had been forced to create international laws banning their own creations. They had split the atom, touched their moon, and sent machines to explore their neighboring planets, all while maintaining enough nuclear weapons to sterilize their surface several times over. They were, by any objective measure, completely unpredictable. The diplomatic summit was scheduled for 30 cycles later. Neutral territory, naturally. The humans sent a delegation of 12 representatives, not their governmental leaders, not their military commanders. Just 12 seemingly random individuals from different regions of their planet. Victoria Kane was among them. She was shorter in person than her transmissions had suggested. Most humans were. But she carried herself with that same casual confidence, that same subtle smile that suggested she knew something everyone else didn't. Ambassador Vex 9, she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. I had studied this custom. The clasping of appendages, originally meant to demonstrate that neither party was armed. I extended my primary manipulator, and we completed the ritual. Victoria Kane. I believe we've corresponded. You threatened to destabilize an entire sector of space. I suggested that aggressive actions would have consequences. Her smile widened. Totally different thing. So, should we talk about trade agreements? And, just like that, as if the previous confrontation had never occurred, she launched into a detailed discussion of potential economic partnerships, mineral rights, technology exchanges, cultural programs, all presented with the same easy confidence that had characterized her ultimatum. The other human delegates were similar, knowledgeable, professional, and utterly unconcerned about the massive power imbalance in the room. They negotiated like equals because they had made themselves equals. Through sheer audacity and a willingness to embrace chaos. "Can I ask you something?" I said during a break in the proceedings. Victoria Kane looked up from her datapad. "Sure. Were you serious? About the dead man switches and the kinetic weapons?" She considered the question for a moment, then shrugged. "Does it matter? We convinced you we were serious. That's what counts." "So, it was a bluff." "I didn't say that." Her expression was unreadable. "Look, here's the thing about humans. We're really good at two things: adapting and escalating. You bring a sword, we bring a gun. You bring a gun, we bring a tank. You bring a tank, we figure out how to blow up the tank. It's kind of our whole deal. So were we bluffing about having automated systems that would launch a bunch of nasty stuff if you attacked us? Maybe, maybe not. But the real question is, do you want to find out? That's extortion. That's deterrence." She leaned back in her seat. "The council had 3,000 cycles of nobody challenging your authority. That made you comfortable, made you assume everyone would just fall in line. But humans? We don't do comfortable. We don't do complacent. We're the species that looked at the ocean and said, 'I bet there's something on the other side.' We're the species that looked at the sky and said, 'I bet we can go there.' We're the species that looked at the atom and said, 'I bet we can split that.' And that makes you superior? No." Her tone softened slightly. "It makes us persistent, and really, really annoying to try and conquer. Which is why we should just skip the whole conquering thing and be friends instead." The summit concluded with a treaty that granted Earth autonomous status, limited integration with Council systems, open trade relations, cultural exchange programs, everything Victoria Kane had demanded in her initial transmission. As the human delegation prepared to depart, Quix 12 approached Victoria Kane. "You realize you've set a dangerous precedent. Other species will see what you've done and attempt similar resistance." "Good," she replied. "Everyone should get to choose their own path. That's kind of the whole point. The galaxy will descend into chaos without unified authority." Or, Victoria Kane said, that infuriating smile returning, "The galaxy will become a lot more interesting. Guess we'll find out." As I watched their vessel depart, I couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had shifted. For 3,000 cycles, the Council had maintained order through strength and authority. Then, along came humanity, who looked at that authority and said, "No thank you," while juggling nuclear weapons and laughing about it. They were going to be a problem. Or possibly the best thing that had happened to the Council in millennia. With humans, I was learning, it was impossible to tell which, until it was too late. 15 cycles passed. The humans called them months, which made absolutely no sense since their planetary rotation and solar orbit had nothing to do with our standardized temporal measurements. But we had stopped trying to make them conform to logic. That was lesson 1 of dealing with humanity. Logic was optional. During those 15 cycles, everything changed. The Council had expected the humans to quietly establish their trade routes, maybe set up a few embassies, learn how things worked in civilized galactic society. Instead, they did what humans apparently always did. They ignored expectations entirely and invented their own rules. The first incident happened at Station Kelvar, a major trading hub in the Outer Rim. A Torlian merchant vessel had been caught price-gouging smaller species who lacked the resources to challenge their monopoly on medical supplies. Standard practice, unfortunately. The Council had regulations against it, but enforcement was slow, bureaucratic, and usually ineffective. Then, a human freighter called the Wildfire showed up. Captain Jennifer Okonkwo, a woman with dark skin and eyes that seemed perpetually amused by some private joke, docked her vessel and immediately started selling the exact same medical supplies at 70% below market rate. When the Torlian merchants complained to station authorities, she smiled that distinctly human smile and said, "Free market, friends. Don't like the competition?" lower your prices. The Torlians tried to force her out through legal channels. Jennifer Okonkwo responded by broadcasting her inventory and prices across every communication channel in the sector. Within hours, 12 more human vessels arrived, all carrying medical supplies, all undercutting the Torlian monopoly. When the Torlians threatened violence, Captain Okonkwo just laughed. You really want to fight over the right to overcharge dying people for medicine? Because that's a bad look, guys. Really bad. And we record everything. The Torlians backed down. The monopoly collapsed. And suddenly, human merchants were everywhere, disrupting established trade patterns with aggressive competition and complete disregard for how things had always been done. They're destroying economic stability, Councillor Trix 8 complained during an emergency session. 7 major cartels have filed protests. The humans are interfering with established business relationships. Established exploitation, you mean? I corrected, reviewing the data. Every market the humans have entered was operating with significant price inflation due to monopolistic practices. They're simply introducing actual competition. That's not how galactic commerce works. Perhaps it should be. Quick's 12 sensory stalks twisted in my direction. You're defending them? I'm observing reality. The humans aren't violating any trade laws. They're just operating without respect for the unofficial arrangements that have governed commerce for centuries. And species who were being exploited are responding positively. That was an understatement. 5 smaller species had already approached human merchants about establishing permanent trade agreements. 2 had formally requested that Earth advocate for them in council disputes. Humanity had been in galactic society for barely 15 cycles, and they were already building a coalition. The second incident was more concerning. The Krathgor Dominion had a long-standing territorial dispute with the Pelvic Collective over a resource-rich asteroid belt. For decades, they had maintained an aggressive military presence, essentially daring the much smaller Pelvic to challenge them. The Council, as usual, had issued statements about seeking peaceful resolution while doing precisely nothing. Then, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a human military advisor working with the Pelvic Defense Forces, suggested a solution. You can't match their military strength, he explained. During a recorded strategy session we later intercepted. So, don't try. Instead, make the territory too expensive to hold. The Pelvic, who were a cautious species with minimal combat experience, were skeptical. How do we accomplish this without direct confrontation? Lieutenant Webb grinned. Humans did that a lot when they were about to cause problems. Asymmetric warfare. You mine the entire disputed region with dormant proximity charges. Nothing active, nothing that violates the ceasefire agreement. Just a whole lot of potential explosions. Then you broadcast the locations of exactly 3% of the mines. Make it clear that there are thousands more scattered throughout the belt. But you're not saying where. That's defensive preparation, not aggression, one Pelvic councillor observed. Exactly. Completely legal under current treaties. But here's the fun part. Now the Krathgor have to ask themselves, is this asteroid belt worth potentially losing dozens of mining vessels? Worth the cost of clearing thousands of mines from a 3-dimensional space? Worth the casualties? They implemented his strategy within a cycle. The Krathgor withdrew within 2. When questioned about this development, Lieutenant Webb maintained complete innocence. We provided strategic consultation. The Pelvic made their own decisions. That's how military advisory positions work, right? The Council was less amused. The humans are teaching smaller species to resist established hierarchies, Quix 12 observed during our closed session. First, economic disruption. Now, military consultation. They're systematically undermining Council authority. Or, they're helping species defend themselves against bullying, Councillor Mira 4 countered. She was a newer member, representing a species that had recently joined the Council. Perhaps the real problem is that our current system relies on smaller species accepting their subordinate positions without complaint. The debate that followed was, intense. The council chamber had rarely witnessed such open disagreement. But Mira 4 had identified something important. Humanity's presence was forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about how galactic society actually functioned. Meanwhile, humans continued being humans. Dr. Amara Kita, a xenobiologist from Earth's African Union, revolutionized interspecies medicine by simply ignoring the established practice of species-specific treatment protocols. She started cross-referencing biological data across species boundaries, finding commonalities that traditional galactic medicine had overlooked because nobody had questioned the assumption that every species required completely separate medical approaches. Her work led to breakthrough treatments for 3 previously incurable conditions affecting 7 different species. When asked why no one had tried this before, she shrugged and said, "Because you were all thinking inside your separate boxes. We look at problems sideways." Tommy Chen, a human engineer, took one look at the standardized ship propulsion systems used throughout Council space and declared them hilariously inefficient. Within 6 cycles, he had redesigned the core principles using something he called dynamic field modulation. It increased fuel efficiency by 18% across all vessel classes. "But we've been using the current design for 800 cycles," the lead council engineer protested. "Yeah, that's kind of the problem," Tommy replied. "You found something that worked and stopped innovating. We find something that works and immediately try to make it better, faster, and cheaper. Usually while breaking several safety regulations and praying nothing explodes. That's insane. That's progress. And everywhere humans went, they talked, constantly, about everything. They asked questions nobody else asked. Why does this work this way? Who decided that was the rule? What happens if we try something different? They challenged assumptions that had stood unchallenged for millennia, not out of malice or rebellion, but simply because they were genuinely curious. It was exhausting. It was disruptive. And it was absolutely working. I found myself assigned to the newly created Human Liaison Office, a position that hadn't existed 15 cycles ago but had become necessary as human involvement in council affairs expanded exponentially. My job was officially to facilitate communication and cultural understanding. Unofficially, it was to predict what insane thing humans would do next and try to minimize the chaos. That's how I ended up in a conference room with Victoria Kane again, discussing what she cheerfully called Project Phoenix. "So let me understand this correctly," I said, reviewing the proposal document. "You want Council permission to establish an independent scientific research facility in unclaimed space for the explicit purpose of conducting experiments that are currently prohibited under Council safety regulations. That's one way to phrase it." Victoria Kane sipped her coffee, that strange human stimulant beverage they consumed in alarming quantities. "I prefer to think of it as creating a designated innovation zone where we can test advanced technologies without risking established populations. You want permission to do dangerous experiments far away from anyone. Who can stop you? Now you're getting it. This is monumentally irresponsible." "Probably." She set down her coffee and leaned forward. "But here's the thing, Vex. Your council has very sensible safety regulations, very cautious approval processes, very careful risk assessment protocols, which is why your technology has advanced at a steady, predictable, incredibly slow pace for the last 2,000 cycles. Slow and safe is preferable to fast and catastrophic. Is it, though?" She pulled up a holographic display showing technological advancement curves. "Look at human development over the last 200 years. Exponential growth. Why? Because we're willing to fail. We try crazy stuff. Most of it doesn't work. Some of it explodes. But occasionally, something revolutionary happens. Your system eliminates the explosions, sure, but it also eliminates the revolutions. We prefer stability. Propulsion systems unchanged for 8 centuries. medical technology advancing at minuscule increments, communication systems that still use protocols designed before half the council species even achieved spaceflight. You've built a society that's really good at maintaining the status quo and really bad at adapting to change. And you believe reckless experimentation is superior? I believe that sometimes you need to break things to learn how they work, and sometimes you discover that the broken thing works better than the original. She closed the holographic display. Look, we're not asking for council funding or resources. We're not demanding anything. We're just asking for permission to go out into empty space and tinker with stuff that might blow up. If it goes wrong, we're far enough away that nobody else gets hurt. If it goes right, we share the results. Everyone wins. Except when you accidentally create something catastrophic. Then, we deal with the consequences. That's kind of our thing, remember? We're really good at cleaning up our own messes. Usually, eventually, most of the time. Despite my better judgment, I found myself laughing. Humans were contagious like that. Their enthusiasm, their optimism, their absolute refusal to be discouraged by the possibility of failure. It was simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. I'll present your proposal to the council. You're the best, Vex. She stood, offering that hand-clasping gesture again. Oh, and one more thing. We're also requesting formal observer status at council sessions, not voting membership, just the ability to attend meetings and participate in discussions. Why? Because we want to understand how decisions get made, and because we might have some ideas that could help. That smile again, the one that suggested she was already 3 moves ahead. Plus, it's really hard to complain about council policies if we're not actually present to hear them being debated. Seems only fair. The council session where I presented both proposals was memorable. Predictably, several councillors objected immediately. We cannot allow humans unsupervised access to potentially dangerous technologies, Trix 8 argued. Their track record demonstrates a concerning lack of caution. Their track record demonstrates unprecedented innovation, Mira 4 countered. Perhaps we should be learning from them rather than restricting them. As for observer status, Quix 12 said, carefully, the precedent concerns me. If we allow humans, other species will request similar accommodation. Good, I heard myself saying. Everyone turned to stare at me. Isn't that the point of a council? Shouldn't more voices lead to better decisions? The council functions efficiently because we maintain established procedures? Another councillor objected. The council functions predictably, I corrected. Whether that translates to efficiency is debatable. The humans have been part of galactic society for barely 15 cycles, and they've already identified numerous inefficiencies in our systems. Perhaps having them present to point out our blind spots would be valuable. The debate continued for hours. Eventually, a compromise emerged. Humans would receive observer status with limited participation rights. Project Phoenix would be permitted, but with regular inspections and mandatory progress reports. It wasn't everything Victoria Kane had requested, but it was more than anyone had expected the council to grant. As I transmitted the decision to Earth, I wondered what we had just agreed to. Humans, with official access to council proceedings. Humans conducting unrestricted research in deep space. What could possibly go wrong? The answer came sooner than expected. 6 cycles after Project Phoenix became operational, they invited council representatives to tour the facility. I volunteered, partly out of curiosity, and partly because someone needed to document whatever madness the humans had created. The station was impressive. Massive modular construction, advanced defensive systems, and enough redundant safety measures to satisfy even the most paranoid engineer. But the real surprise was what they were working on. Dr. Hida met me at the docking port. Welcome to Phoenix Station, Vex. Ready to see something amazing? She led me through corridors filled with humans and non-humans working side by side. I recognized Pelvic, Torlian, even a few Krathgor technicians collaborating on various projects. The facility wasn't exclusively human. It was a coalition. How did you manage this? I asked. Turns out lots of species have scientists who are frustrated by the Council's slow approval processes. We offered them a space to work without bureaucratic interference. They accepted. Dr. Kita stopped at a large observation window. But that's not what I wanted to show you. Beyond the window was something impossible. A ship, but unlike any vessel I had recognized. The hull seemed to shift, reflecting and absorbing light simultaneously. The propulsion system was completely foreign. That's the Prometheus. Experimental faster-than-light drive, using principles we developed by combining Torlian gravitational theory with Krathgor dimensional mathematics and human quantum mechanics. It's 3 times faster than conventional drives and uses 40% less energy. That's impossible. It was impossible under Council regulations that kept each species' research separate. We just asked what would happen if everyone shared their expertise. Turns out, combining knowledge from multiple species creates exponential improvements. Who knew? She grinned. Well, we suspected. That's why we built this place. I watched the Prometheus conduct test maneuvers, moving with impossible grace and speed. You're changing everything. We're trying to. Dr. Kita's expression became serious. The Council has maintained peace and stability for a long time. That's genuinely impressive. But it's also created stagnation. Species stay in their lanes, follow their assigned roles, don't question the established order. And anyone who tries to do things differently gets reminded of their place. You're describing the foundation of galactic civilization. I'm describing a system that stopped growing, and things that stop growing start dying. She turned from the window. Humans aren't trying to destroy the Council. We're trying to save it from itself. By showing that cooperation doesn't have to mean conformity, that innovation doesn't have to threaten stability, that different approaches can coexist without one dominating the others. Through demonstration. Through example. We can't force the Council to change. We tried that approach during first contact, remember? Didn't make us any friends. But we can show what's possible when species work together as equals instead of subordinates. She started walking again. Come on, I want to show you the Medical Research Division. We're working on universal antibiotics that function across species boundaries. Very exciting stuff. The tour continued for hours. Every laboratory, every research project demonstrated the same principle. Humans taking existing knowledge, combining it with insights from other species, and producing results that should have taken decades to achieve. And they were doing it through voluntary cooperation, not Council mandate. When I returned to my vessel, I had 17 data modules filled with research findings, 3 formal collaboration proposals from non-human scientists, and a completely revised understanding of what humans were actually doing. They weren't rebelling against the Council. They were making it irrelevant. The emergency Council session was predictable. Panic, outrage, demands for immediate action. The humans had created a parallel research institution that was outpacing Council-approved facilities. They were recruiting scientists from member species. They were developing technologies that undermined established industries. Something had to be done. What exactly do you propose? I asked when the initial fury subsided. We granted them permission to establish the facility. They're operating within the parameters we approved. They're sharing their research freely. What law have they violated? They're undermining Council authority. They're demonstrating that Council authority isn't necessary for advancement. That's not a violation. That's competition. Quix-12's sensory stalks drooped. He looked exhausted. What do the humans want, Vex? You've spent more time with them than anyone. What's their endgame? I considered the question carefully. I don't think they have one. Not in the way you mean. They're not following some master plan to dominate galactic society. They're just doing what humans do. Pushing boundaries, trying new things, making alliances, solving problems they find interesting. The disruption is a side effect, not the objective. That's worse, Mirafor observed. Intentional rebellion can be negotiated with or suppressed. But this? They're not even trying to challenge us. They're just ignoring our relevance entirely. So we become relevant again, I said. We adapt. We learn. We change our approach to match the new reality humans have created. Or we continue insisting on outdated procedures and watch our influence erode as more species realize there are alternatives. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Quix 12 spoke. What do you recommend? Full partnership. Not integration under council authority, but actual equal collaboration. We invite human participation in council research initiatives. We adopt their open collaboration model. We accept that the galaxy is changing and we need to change with it. That would require admitting we were wrong. That would require admitting we can improve. There's a difference. 3 cycles later, the Council announced a new initiative, joint research partnerships with Project Phoenix, reformed approval processes for experimental technologies, open scientific conferences where any species could present research without bureaucratic restrictions. It was called the Advancement Accord, and it was everything humans had been demonstrating was possible. Victoria Kane attended the announcement ceremony. Afterward, she found me in the diplomatic reception area. You did good work, Vex. This is a real step forward. You manipulated the entire process from the beginning. Manipulated is such an ugly word. We encouraged. We demonstrated. We suggested alternatives. That smile appeared again. But ultimately, the Council made their own choices. We just made sure they had good options to choose from. You terrify me sometimes. Yeah, we get that a lot. She glanced around the reception area, where species who had barely spoken to each other for centuries were now engaged in animated discussions about potential collaborations. But look at this. Real dialogue. Real cooperation. Not because someone mandated it, but because everyone realized it serves their interests. That's how lasting change happens. And if it hadn't worked? If the Council had remained rigid? Victoria Kane shrugged. Then we would have continued building our alternative networks until enough species joined us that the Council became irrelevant, or until they decided to attack us, in which case we'd have demonstrated again why that's a really bad idea. But it worked out better this way. Everyone wins. You had contingency plans for every scenario. We had lots of contingency plans. Humans are really good at planning. We're just not very good at sticking to those plans once things start happening. We prefer improvisation. I laughed, despite myself. That should be your species' motto. Humanity. We prefer improvisation. I like it. Very honest. She extended her hand again. Partners? I clasped her hand in return. Partners. Though I suspect this partnership will give me more gray chromatic shifts than I'd prefer. Probably. But you'll never be bored. She was right about that. Over the following cycles, galactic society transformed. Not through revolution or mandate, but through countless small collaborations that accumulated into fundamental change. Species that had maintained rigid hierarchies for millennia began questioning why things had to work that way. Technologies that had been restricted as too dangerous were re-evaluated and approved when proper safety protocols were demonstrated. Young researchers who had felt constrained by traditional career paths found new opportunities in cross-species collaboration. And at the center of it all were humans, not leading or commanding, but encouraging and enabling, asking uncomfortable questions, suggesting impossible solutions, demonstrating through action what cooperation could achieve. They were everything the Council had feared. Disruptive, unpredictable, challenging established order at every opportunity. They were also everything the galaxy had needed. Innovative, adaptable, willing to embrace change rather than resist it. The Council of Unified Territories still existed, still maintained its role in mediating disputes and coordinating large-scale initiatives. But it was no longer the sole source of authority it had been for 3,000 cycles. Now, it was one voice among many, participating in an increasingly complex and vibrant galactic community. And the humans? They continued being impossible, infuriating, and absolutely essential. Victoria Kane sent me a message on the anniversary of first contact, just a simple note with an attached image. The image showed her standing in front of a memorial on Earth, a monument dedicated to the moment humanity chose to stand rather than kneel. The message read, "Thanks for not obliterating us. This partnership thing is working out pretty well. Same time next year to discuss what ridiculous thing we're planning next?" I transmitted my response immediately. I look forward to it with equal parts anticipation and dread. Because that was the reality of dealing with humans. They would never be predictable, never be compliant, never follow the established path when they could forge a new one instead. But they would be partners, allies, friends, even in their own chaotic way. And the galaxy was better for it, even if they did make my chromatic sacs shift into stress patterns on a disturbingly regular basis.